The gunshot that rang through the dusty streets of Silver Creek was not meant for Zadie Foster. But it may as well have been. It was the sound that brought her face to face with her past. Zadie ducked instinctively as the bullet shattered the window of the general store behind her. The year was 1878, and she had been in Silver Creek for less than an hour. 5 years away had changed nothing. The town was still lawless, dangerous, and apparently unwelcoming to a woman traveling alone. "Get down." A strong hand grabbed her shoulder and pulled her behind a water trough just as another shot rang out. She found herself pressed against the weathered wood, face to face with a pair of familiar blue eyes. Eyes she'd once known better than her own. Eyes she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. "Preston Abernathy," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and yet all too familiar on her lips. His face was more weathered now, lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd left. A thin scar ran along his jaw, but the rest, those eyes, the determined set of his mouth, was unchanged. "Zadie." The disbelief in his voice matched the shock in his expression. "Zadie Foster." Before she could answer, more gunfire erupted from down the street. Preston peered over the trough, then ducked back down. "2 men outside the saloon. Seems like a disagreement over cards. Nothing to do with us, but we're in their line of fire." He glanced toward the hotel across the street. "We need to move. Stay low and follow me." Zadie nodded, gathering her skirts and preparing to run. As they crouched there, Preston's gaze traveled over her face, drinking in the changes 5 years had wrought. "When this is over," he said, "we have a lot to talk about." The gunfight ceased momentarily and Preston nodded. "Now." They dashed across the street, dust kicking up beneath their boots. Zadie's heart pounded as they burst through the hotel doors and into the relative safety of the lobby. The elderly clerk behind the desk barely looked up from his newspaper. "Another dispute at Miller's?" he asked disinterestedly. "Same as usual," Preston confirmed, then turned to Zadie. His expression had hardened, the initial shock replaced by something cooler, more distant. "What are you doing back in Silver Creek?" Zadie straightened her spine. "I came to settle my father's estate." "I received word he passed 3 weeks ago." Preston's face softened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear about Harold. He was a good man." "Thank you." Zadie glanced around the lobby, suddenly aware of her dishevelment, her traveling dress covered in dust, her hair coming loose from its pins. "I should get a room and make myself presentable." "I'll wait," Preston said, not a request but a statement of fact. "We need to talk, Zadie." She nodded, knowing this confrontation had been inevitable the moment she'd decided to return. She approached the desk and secured a room, pointedly ignoring the clerk's raised eyebrows at a single woman checking in alone. An hour later, with her appearance restored and her nerves somewhat steadied, Zadie descended the stairs to find Preston waiting in a corner of the lobby. He stood as she approached, removing his hat, a gesture of courtesy that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. He led her to the small hotel restaurant, where they sat at a table by the window. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared past hanging between them like a curtain. "You look well," Preston finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "So do you." Zadie folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Sheriff now, I see." She nodded at the badge pinned to his vest. "For the past 3 years." He studied her face. "Boston agrees with you." Zadie blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was in Boston?" A shadow of something passed across his face. "Your father mentioned it. We stayed in touch." The knowledge that Preston and her father had maintained a connection, while she'd been trying so hard to forget everything about Silver Creek, sent an unexpected pang through her chest. "I didn't know," she said softly. "There's a lot you don't know, Zadie." His voice had an edge to it now. The waitress approached with coffee, providing a momentary reprieve from the tension. When she'd gone, Preston leaned forward. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised her. Preston had never been one to circle around difficult topics, but Zadie found herself unprepared to answer. "I had my reasons," she said eventually. Reasons you couldn't share with the man you were supposed to marry in a week's time. The controlled calm in his voice belied the hurt in his eyes. Preston, please. It was complicated. No, Zadie, it wasn't. You disappeared. Left a note saying you couldn't go through with it, and that was that. 5 years without a word. Zadie looked down at her coffee cup. I'm sorry. Preston's laugh was short and humorless. Sorry doesn't explain why the woman I loved vanished without a trace. I'm not who you remember, she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not that girl anymore. Preston studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, his face softened. Then let's start again tonight, he said quietly. Forget the past. Tell me about the woman sitting across from me now. The simplicity of his offer caught her off guard. Start again. Could it really be that easy? I don't know if that's possible, she admitted. I'm not asking for promises, Zadie, just conversation, dinner, the chance to know who you've become. Before she could respond, the hotel doors burst open and a young boy rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. Sheriff Abernathy. There's trouble at the bank. Preston stood immediately, placing his hat back on his head. I have to go. He hesitated, then added, have dinner with me tomorrow, 7 o'clock. It wasn't quite a question, but Zadie found herself nodding anyway. 7 o'clock. As she watched him stride out of the hotel, Zadie wondered if she'd just made another mistake. Starting again sounded simple enough, but nothing about her history with Preston Abernathy had ever been simple. The next morning, Zadie made her way to her father's law office on the main street. The familiar sign, Harold Foster, attorney at law, brought a lump to her throat. She used the key she'd found among her father's personal effects at the house and stepped inside. The office smelled of leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and dust exactly as she remembered. She ran her fingers along the edge of her father's desk, picturing him bent over documents, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair stood in the doorway. Miss Foster. I'm George Wilson, your father's clerk. I came as soon as I heard you were in town. Mr. Wilson, yes, thank you for keeping things in order. Your father was a good man, the best lawyer Silver Creek ever had. He stepped inside, carrying a stack of files. These are the current cases he was handling, and these, he placed another, smaller stack on the desk, are the documents pertaining to his estate. Zadie nodded gratefully. I appreciate your help. I'll need to review everything before deciding what to do with the practice. Of course. He hesitated. If I may, Miss Foster, there are quite a few people in town who relied on your father, if you were to consider staying and taking over. I'm a teacher in Boston, Mr. Wilson, not a lawyer. Yes, but with your education, your father always spoke so proudly of your intellect, and perhaps with some guidance from Judge Harmon. Zadie shook her head. I have a life in Boston. I only returned to settle my father's affairs. The clerk nodded, disappointment evident in his expression. Of course. Well, I'm at your disposal should you need any assistance during your stay. After he left, Zadie sank into her father's chair, overwhelmed by the task before her. She began sorting through the papers, losing track of time as she immersed herself in her father's final work. A shadow fell across the desk, and she looked up to find Preston standing in the doorway, watching her. You look right at home there, he said. Zadie set down the document she'd been reading. Just trying to make sense of everything. I can help if you'd like. I worked with your father on many of his cases. Thank you, but Mr. Wilson has offered his assistance. Preston nodded, accepting her polite refusal. I came by to make sure our dinner plans still stand, and to warn you that there's a storm coming in tonight. I thought we might eat at my place instead of the hotel. Zadie hesitated. Dining alone with Preston at his home seemed far more intimate than a public restaurant. Noting her hesitation, he added, My housekeeper, Mrs. Byans, will be there. I just thought you might prefer somewhere quieter to talk. All right, she agreed, relieved at the mention of a chaperone. I appreciate the thoughtfulness. I'll send my buggy for you at 6:30. The Foster house is still a way out of town. "I remember," she said softly. Preston lingered in the doorway. "It's good to see you there, Zadie. Your father would be pleased." After he'd gone, Zadie found it difficult to focus on the documents. Her thoughts kept returning to Preston, to his unexpected kindness, to the hint of the man she'd once loved still visible beneath the harder exterior he now presented. That evening, as promised, a buggy arrived at precisely 6:30. The driver was a young man Zadie didn't recognize, who tipped his hat politely and helped her aboard before the first raindrops began to fall. Preston's home was on the outskirts of town, a modest but well-built two-story house with a wide porch and a barn behind it. Lights glowed warmly from the windows as the buggy pulled up, and Preston emerged onto the porch to greet her, holding a large umbrella. He escorted her inside, where delicious aromas filled the air. An older woman with a kind face emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Foster, this is Mrs. Byans, the saint who keeps this household running." "Welcome, Miss Foster." Mrs. Byans's smile was genuine. "The sheriff has spoken of you often." Zadie glanced at Preston, who looked momentarily embarrassed. "Thank you for preparing dinner, Mrs. Byans." "It smells wonderful. I've set everything up in the dining room. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." With that, she disappeared back through the swinging door. Preston showed Zadie to a comfortable sitting room while they waited for dinner to be served. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the rain pattered against the windows. "You have a lovely home," Zadie said, taking in the well-crafted furniture and tasteful decorations. It was not at all what she would have expected from the young ranch hand she'd known 5 years ago. "Thank you. I built most of it myself." "You built it?" she asked, surprised. He nodded, pride evident in his expression. "The previous sheriff, Thomas Collins, you might remember him, he had no children, took me under his wing after you left. Taught me the law, then backed me for sheriff when he retired, left me this land when he passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "He must have thought highly of you. He was a good man, saw something in me when I was at my lowest." Preston's gaze was direct. "He's the one who convinced me to make something of myself instead of drowning in whiskey and self-pity." The candid admission made Zadie wince. "Preston, No," he interrupted gently. "I didn't say that to make you feel guilty. I said we'd start fresh tonight, and I meant it." He gestured toward the dining room. "Shall we?" The dining table was set elegantly with china and silver that must have belonged to the former sheriff. A bottle of wine stood open, breathing, as they settled into their seats, Mrs. Byans brought out the first course, a rich vegetable soup that tasted of comfort and home. "So," Preston said after they'd begun eating, "tell me about Boston." Grateful for the neutral topic, Zadie told him about her position teaching at a girls' school, her small but comfortable apartment, and the friends she'd made. As she spoke, she realized how much of her life there was defined by routine and obligation rather than passion or joy. "It sounds respectable," Preston observed when she finished. "It is. Exactly what I wanted: stability, purpose." "Is it?" His question was gentle but probing. Zadie took a sip of wine. "What about you? Sheriff of Silver Creek is quite an accomplishment." Preston allowed the change of subject. "It has its challenges. The town's growing. The new rail line means more travelers, more businesses, more trouble." He smiled slightly. "But it's home. Is there a Mrs. Sheriff?" The question slipped out before Zadie could stop it. "No," Preston replied simply. "There was almost once." The weight of his words hung between them. Mrs. Byans's arrival with the main course, roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, provided a welcome interruption. As they ate, the conversation turned to mutual acquaintances from years past who had married, who had children, who had moved on. It was safer territory, though occasionally a shared memory would bring a momentary awkwardness. "Do you remember the harvest dance, the autumn before?" Preston trailed off. "Well, that autumn," Zadie smiled despite herself, "when you stepped on Mrs. Tolliver's prize pumpkin and nearly caused a riot. In my defense, I was distracted by a certain young lady in a blue dress. The memory was so vivid, the makeshift dance floor in the town square, lanterns hanging from trees, the fiddler playing while couples whirled beneath the stars. It had been the first time Preston had kissed her in public, uncaring of the whispers and stares. "We were so young," Zadie murmured. "We were," Preston agreed, "but not anymore." The implication hung in the air between them. They'd both changed, grown. The question was whether those changes had brought them further apart or created the possibility of something new. After dinner, they retired back to the sitting room with coffee. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. "I should return to town soon," Zadie said, though the thought of venturing out into the storm was unappealing. Preston shook his head. "Not in this weather. The road to town will be mud by now, maybe worse. You can stay in the guest room tonight." Seeing her hesitation, he added, "Mrs. Byron's lives in the small cottage behind the house, but she'll stay in her room here tonight to maintain proprieties." Zadie knew he was right about the roads. "Thank you, that's very considerate," Preston smiled. "I've learned a few things about consideration over the years." As they sat before the fire, the comfortable silence that had once been so natural between them gradually returned. The tension of their first encounters began to ease. "Why Boston?" Preston asked suddenly. "Of all the places you could have gone." Zadie stared into the flames. "It was far away." "Different. No one knew me there. You wanted to disappear." "I wanted to start over." She met his gaze. "I was 19, Preston. The thought of spending my entire life in Silver Creek, never seeing anything beyond these mountains and valleys. You could have told me that," he said quietly. "We could have found a way." "Could we? You loved this land. Your family had been here for generations. How could I ask you to give that up? You didn't give me the choice." There was no accusation in his voice, only a statement of fact. "You decided for both of us." Zadie looked away. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of making the wrong choice, of regretting it later and resenting you, of becoming my mother." Preston's eyes widened slightly. "Your mother? I don't understand." Zadie took a deep breath. "My mother didn't die of fever when I was young, Preston. She left. She abandoned my father and me because she couldn't stand the constraints of life here. She ran off with a traveling salesman." The admission felt like ripping off a bandage from a wound that had never properly healed. "My father told everyone she died to spare us the shame." Preston leaned forward. "Zadie, I had no idea." "No one did. Only my father and I knew the truth." She twisted her hands in her lap. "When we became engaged, I started having dreams, nightmares of doing the same thing. Of leaving you, of hurting you that way. And the more I tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they became, until I convinced myself that leaving before our wedding was kinder than leaving after." Preston was silent for a long moment, processing her revelation. "Did you find what you were looking for in Boston?" Zadie considered the question. "I found independence, respect for my work, but, she met his gaze directly, "not happiness, not the kind I once thought we might have." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Preston moved to sit beside her on the sofa. Tentatively, he took her hand in his. "I'm not asking for promises, Zadie, but I think we owe ourselves the chance to discover who we are now, not who we were then." Zadie looked down at their joined hands. "What if we find we're too different now?" "Then at least we'll know." His voice was gentle. "And perhaps we can find a way to be friends." The idea of friendship with Preston seemed both inadequate and a relief, a middle ground that offered safety while they navigated these uncharted waters. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Mrs. Byron's appeared to inform them she'd prepared the guest room, and Zadie gratefully retired for the night, her mind swirling with the day's revelations. She lay awake for hours, listening to the storm raging outside while her thoughts turned over and over. She'd come back to Silver Creek, expecting to settle her father's affairs quickly and return to Boston. She hadn't expected Preston to still be here, hadn't expected him to suggest starting anew, and certainly hadn't expected to find herself considering the possibility. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Zadie found Preston in the kitchen, cooking breakfast while Mrs. Byans was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning," he greeted her with a smile. "Coffee, please." She sat at the small kitchen table, watching as he moved confidently around the space. "Where's Mrs. Byans?" "Had to check on her sister in town. The storm knocked down some trees." He placed a cup of coffee before her. "Hope you don't mind my cooking. I'm not as skilled as Mrs. Byans, but I can manage eggs and bacon." There was something disarmingly domestic about the scene Preston cooking breakfast, the morning light streaming through the windows, the comfortable quiet between them. "I never pictured you as a sheriff who cooks," she said, smiling. "Life's full of surprises." He served the food and joined her at the table. "Speaking of which, I have business in town today, but I was wondering if you might like to ride out to the Foster property with me this afternoon. See how it's faring." Zadie hadn't yet visited her childhood home, having taken a room at the hotel upon her arrival. The thought of seeing it again brought mixed emotions. "Is someone living there now?" she asked. Preston nodded. "Your father rented it to the Millers, James and Mary, with their 3 children. Good people. They've taken good care of the place." The knowledge that her family home was filled with another family was both strange and comforting. At least it hadn't stood empty. "I'd like that," she decided. "Thank you." After breakfast, Preston drove her back to town, the roads indeed muddy but passable. They agreed to meet at 3 o'clock for the ride to the Foster property. Zadie spent the morning at her father's office, working with Mr. Wilson to understand the status of ongoing cases. Many would need to be transferred to Judge Harmon or lawyers in neighboring towns, but it was clear her father had been a respected and integral part of the community. "Your father was more than just a lawyer to many folks around here," Mr. Wilson told her. "He was an advisor, a mediator, sometimes even a confessor. People trusted him." "I know," Zadie said softly. "He was a good man." "The best," Mr. Wilson agreed. "He missed you terribly, you know, kept that picture of you on his desk until the day he died." He nodded toward a small, framed photograph that Zadie had noticed earlier herself at 18, smiling and full of hope. The observation made her throat tighten with emotion. Did he ever speak of why I left?" Mr. Wilson's expression was kind. "He said you had dreams bigger than Silver Creek could hold. Said he was proud of you for having the courage to chase them." Tears pricked at Zadie's eyes. Her father had known nothing of her mother's abandonment. She discovered the truth only by accident, finding old letters in his desk after his brief illness when she was 17. He'd never known that her flight from Silver Creek had been born partly of fear rather than ambition. At precisely 3 o'clock, Preston arrived at the law office with 2 horses. Zadie changed into a split riding skirt she'd packed for just such an occasion and met him outside. He helped her mount with a respectful hand at her elbow, then swung easily into his own saddle. They rode side by side through town and out onto the open road that led toward the Foster property. The familiar landscape brought a rush of memories. The great oak tree where she'd often read books on summer afternoons. The creek where she and Preston had first met she'd been fishing, and he'd been driving cattle for his father's ranch. The overlook where he'd proposed, down on one knee with his grandmother's ring in his hand and hope in his eyes. "It hasn't changed much," she observed, as much to distract herself from these memories as to make conversation. "Some things never do," Preston replied. "Though there's talk of the railroad extending a spur line through this valley next year, that would change things considerably. Progress comes even to Silver Creek, it seems. Not everyone sees it as progress. The Cattlemen's Association is fighting it. They're worried about losing grazing land and water rights." "And which side is the sheriff on?" Preston smiled slightly. "The side of keeping the peace, which gets more difficult by the day." He pointed ahead. "There it is." The Foster house came into view as they crested a small rise, a two-story white farmhouse with a wide porch, nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered hills. A small stream ran along the eastern edge of the property, and beyond it stretched fields where her father had once grown hay and kept a few horses. As they approached, a woman appeared on the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. 3 children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "That's Mary Miller," Preston explained. "I sent word this morning that we'd be coming." Mary welcomed them warmly, insisting they come inside for lemonade. The house was much as Zadie remembered, though the Millers had added their own touches: colorful quilts, children's drawings pinned to walls, the scent of baking bread. "Your father was a wonderful landlord," Mary told Zadie as they sat in the kitchen. "When James took ill last winter and we fell behind on the rent, your father brought us food instead of demanding payment, said we could settle up when times got better." The story didn't surprise Zadie. Her father had always been generous, sometimes to a fault. "I'm glad he had good tenants," she said sincerely. After the lemonade, Mary offered to show Zadie around, giving her space to reacquaint herself with her childhood home. Preston stayed behind, entertaining the children with stories of his work as sheriff carefully edited for young ears. In what had once been her father's study, Zadie found many of his personal belongings still intact: his favorite pipes, books, the old globe he'd used to show her all the places in the world she might someday visit. "We didn't touch his personal things," Mary explained. "Mr. Foster said someone would come for them eventually. I guess that someone was you." Zadie ran her fingers over the spines of her father's books. "Yes, I suppose it was." When they returned to the kitchen, they found Preston on the floor, allowing the youngest Miller child to use his back as a mountain for toy soldiers. He scrambled up, looking somewhat embarrassed but pleased. "Ready to head back?" he asked. As they rode away, Zadie looked back over her shoulder at the house. "The Millers seem happy there." "They are. Your father gave them a chance when no one else would. James had some trouble in his past, nothing serious, but enough that folks were hesitant to rent to him. Your father saw past that, saw a man trying to do right by his family. He was a good judge of character," Zadie said, "except when it came to me, perhaps." Preston gave her a sidelong glance. "What do you mean?" He thought I was braver than I was, stronger. "You were plenty brave, Zadie." "It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind." She hadn't expected him to defend her choices, especially not the one that had hurt him most. "Some might call it cowardice." "I might have once," he admitted. "But I've learned that most things aren't so simple as brave or cowardly, right or wrong. We do the best we can with what we know at the time." His words offered an absolution she hadn't realized she was seeking. They rode in companionable silence for a while, until Preston suggested they stop at his favorite spot overlooking the valley. They dismounted at a clearing high above Silver Creek, where the town was visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys as evening approached. The mountains beyond were bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, and wildflowers dotted the meadow around them. "I come here to think sometimes," Preston said as they sat on a fallen log. "Helps put things in perspective." Zadie could see why. The vastness of the landscape made human concerns seem smaller, more manageable. "What will you do with the Foster property?" Preston asked. "The Millers are worried." "I hadn't decided," Zadie admitted, "but I see no reason to disturb their arrangement. They clearly love the place." Preston nodded, relief evident in his expression. "And the law practice? I'll need to close it, arrange for the current cases to be transferred." She hesitated. Unless, Zadie took a deep breath. "Mr. Wilson suggested I might consider staying, taking over my father's practice." Preston's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And what do you think about that idea?" "It's impractical. I'm not a lawyer." "Neither was your father when he started. He read law with Judge Harmon's predecessor." Preston watched her carefully. "Is that the only reason it's impractical?" Zadie looked out over the valley. "I have a life in Boston. Do you have a routine?" The question struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Her days in Boston were ordered, predictable, secure, but rarely exciting or deeply fulfilling. "What about you?" she countered. "Is being sheriff of Silver Creek fulfilling enough for the boy who once talked about seeing the Pacific Ocean?" Preston smiled slightly. "I did see it. 2 years ago, I took a prisoner to San Francisco for trial, stood on the beach and watched the sun set over water that seemed to go on forever." He shrugged. "It was beautiful, but it didn't feel like home. And Silver Creek does. It's where I belong." His gaze was steady. "But I've learned that home isn't just a place. It's people. Connections." The implication hung between them as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Preston stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should head back before dark." As they rode back to town, Zadie found herself seeing Silver Creek with new eyes, not as the confining place she'd fled, but as a community where people knew and cared for one another, where her father had made a difference in countless lives. Could she find purpose here, as Preston had? Could she create a life that combined the independence she'd found in Boston with the connections that gave Silver Creek its heart? And then, there was Preston himself, no longer the impetuous young man she'd left behind, but a man of substance and character, who'd somehow found it in himself to forgive her greatest transgression against him. That evening, they dined at the hotel restaurant, discussing the day's events and carefully avoiding deeper questions about the future. When Preston walked her to her hotel room door, there was a moment brief but charged when she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he simply took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Good night, Zadie. I'll see you tomorrow." As she prepared for bed, Zadie found herself wondering what tomorrow might bring and, more surprisingly, hoping it would include Preston Abernathy. Over the next week, they fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings were spent at her father's office, organizing and making decisions about the practice. Afternoons often found them together, riding to visit clients of her father's who lived outside town, exploring places from their shared past, or simply sitting in the hotel garden talking. In those conversations, Zadie began to see how much Preston had matured. The hot-headed young ranch hand had become a thoughtful leader, respected throughout the county for his fairness and integrity. He'd developed patience, diplomacy, and a wry sense of humor about the foibles of the townsfolk he served. In turn, Preston discovered the confident, educated woman Zadie had become. Her experiences in Boston had given her not only knowledge, but wisdom and a broader perspective on the world. She spoke passionately about her students, about books and ideas, about the changing role of women in society. What neither of them spoke about directly was the growing attraction between them, the lingering glances, the casual touches that sent electricity through Zadie's veins, the way conversation flowed easily one moment and became charged with unspoken feelings the next. It was during a visit to Preston's office at the jailhouse that something shifted between them. Zadie had brought him lunch, a peace offering after a minor disagreement the previous day about the handling of her father's will. The jailhouse was empty of prisoners that day, and Preston invited her to eat with him at his desk. As she handed him the basket Mrs. Byans had prepared, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. "Thank you," Preston said, his voice lower than usual, "for thinking of me." I think of you quite often these days," Zadie admitted, surprising herself with her boldness. Preston set the basket aside without breaking eye contact. "Is that so?" "It is." Zadie's heart raced. "I'm beginning to think returning to Silver Creek wasn't just about settling my father's affairs." "What else was it about?" Preston stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. "Perhaps about settling my own." Zadie looked up at him, aware of how close they were standing. "About facing the past so I could move forward." "And where is forward, Zadie? Boston?" There was vulnerability in his question despite his steady gaze. "I don't know anymore." She reached up tentatively to touch his cheek. "I thought I knew what I wanted. Now I'm not so certain." Preston captured her hand, turning it to press a kiss to her palm. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that Zadie felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm not asking for answers today," he murmured, "but I am asking for honesty. Whatever you decide, don't disappear again. Don't leave without saying goodbye." "I won't," she promised. "Not this time." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Zadie rose on her tiptoes to meet him, and their lips came together in a kiss that was both familiar and entirely new, gentle at first, then deeper as 5 years of absence fell away. When they finally broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I told myself I wouldn't do that until I was sure." "Sure of what?" "That you might stay, or at least that you wouldn't vanish at the first sign of complications." The doubt in his voice was a stark reminder of the hurt she'd caused him. "I understand why you'd question that," she said softly. "I gave you every reason to." "It's not about blame, Zadie. It's about trust. I need to know I can trust you with my heart again." The simple honesty of his statement touched her deeply. "I don't know if I deserve that trust," she admitted, "but I want to earn it." A noise from the street, the arrival of Preston's deputy, forced them to step apart. The moment was broken, but something important had changed between them. That evening, as Zadie sat alone in her hotel room, she found herself at a crossroads. Her time in Silver Creek was drawing to a close. She'd nearly finished settling her father's affairs. Soon, she would need to decide whether to return to Boston or consider a future here. A future that might include Preston. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Could they build something new together, or would the ghosts of their past ultimately come between them? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a young boy from the telegraph office holding an envelope. "Message for Miss Foster," he said, handing it over. Zadie thanked him with a small coin and unfolded the telegram. It was from the headmistress of her school in Boston. "Term begins September 1. Position still available if you return by August 25. Reply needed urgently. Regards, Mrs. Whitmore." Today was August 12. If she chose to return to Boston, she would need to leave Silver Creek within the week to arrive in time. The timeline suddenly made her decision very real, very immediate. She sank onto the edge of her bed, the telegram clutched in her hand. A life in Boston meant security, independence, the respect she'd earned as an educator. It meant a world where women were slowly gaining more rights and opportunities. But Silver Creek no longer seemed like the prison she'd once considered it. The town was changing, growing. And there was her father's legacy, the law practice that had meant so much to him and to the community. Mr. Wilson had been right that she could learn, as her father had, and then there was Preston. Not the boy she'd left, but the man she was coming to admire deeply, a man of principle and compassion, who understood her in ways no one in Boston ever had. Zadie folded the telegram and placed it in her journal. She wouldn't decide tonight, but the clock was now ticking. The next day, she received an unexpected visitor at the law office, Mary Miller, without her children. "Mrs. Miller, what a surprise," Zadie greeted her. "Is everything all right at the farm?" Mary twisted her hands nervously. "I hope you don't mind my coming to town to see you, Miss Foster." "I wanted to speak with you privately about the property." "Of course. Please sit down." Mary perched on the edge of the chair across from the desk. "My husband and I have been saving, you see, every month, putting aside what we could." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small cloth bag. "It's not much yet, only $78, but we were hoping. That is, if you were willing. We'd like to buy the property from you, over time, of course." The request caught Zadie off guard. She'd been considering selling the property, but hadn't thought the Millers would be potential buyers. "We love that land, Miss Foster," Mary continued earnestly. "It's become home to us. James has plans for expanding the vegetable garden, maybe adding some dairy cows. The children have never been happier." Zadie looked at the small bag of hard-earned money on the desk. "Mrs. Miller, I appreciate your candor, and I understand your attachment to the property. but I haven't made any decisions yet about selling." Mary's face fell. "I understand. I just wanted you to know of our interest should you decide to sell. We'd work hard to pay a fair price, however long it took." "I believe you would," Zadie said gently. "And I promise that if I do decide to sell, you and your husband will have the first opportunity to purchase it." Relief washed over Mary's features. "Thank you, Miss Foster. That's all we can ask." After Mary left, Zadie sat lost in thought. The miller's desire to purchase the property added another layer to her decision. If she remained in Silver Creek, she might keep the property in the family, perhaps living there herself while building a law practice in town. If she returned to Boston, selling to the Millers would ensure the land went to people who truly appreciated it. That afternoon, Judge Harmon invited her to tea. The elderly judge had been her father's closest friend, and Zadie had always admired his keen mind and fair approach to justice. "I understand Wilson has been bending your ear about taking over your father's practice," the judge said without preamble once they were settled in his parlor. Zadie smiled. "News travels fast in Silver Creek." "Some things never change," the judge agreed with a twinkle in his eye. "What do you think of the idea?" "I think it's impractical. I'm not qualified." "Nonsense. You're Harold Foster's daughter. You have his intelligence, his sense of justice. The rest can be learned." He stirred his tea thoughtfully. "I could use an apprentice. Been thinking of retiring these past few years, but there's no one suitable to take over the circuit." Zadie blinked in surprise. "Judge Harmon, are you offering to teach me law?" "I'm suggesting it's a possibility worth considering. This town needs someone with your father's values. Someone the people can trust." He fixed her with a penetrating gaze. "And perhaps you need something more meaningful than teaching young ladies in Boston to speak French and play the pianoforte." "My teaching is meaningful," Zadie protested, though with less conviction than she might have a month ago. "Is it? Is it challenging you, using all those remarkable gifts your father was so proud of?" The question echoed Preston's observation about routine versus fulfillment, and Zadie found herself without a ready answer. Judge Harmon patted her hand. "Just think about it, my dear. No need to decide today." But time was running short. Zadie knew she needed to send a response to Mrs. Whitmore soon. That evening, Preston invited her to a town social at the newly completed church hall. It would be their first public appearance together since her return, a statement of sorts to the curious townsfolk who had been watching their renewed acquaintance with interest. Zadie wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, and felt a flutter of nervousness as Preston escorted her into the hall. Conversation momentarily ceased as people noticed their arrival, then resumed with increased animation. "Ignore them," Preston murmured. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." The evening was pleasant music from local musicians, simple refreshments, conversation with townspeople Zadie had known in her youth. Many expressed condolences about her father and inquired about her life in Boston, while others hinted at their hope that she might consider returning to Silver Creek permanently. "You're quite the topic of conversation," Preston observed as they took a turn about the room. The prodigal daughter returned. "Prodigal implies wasteful or irresponsible," Zadie corrected him with a small smile. "I've been neither." "No," Preston agreed, "but you have been missed." The simple statement touched her. "I've missed certain aspects of Silver Creek as well," she admitted. The sense of community, knowing one's neighbors, the open spaces. As the evening progressed, Zadie found herself enjoying the gathering more than she'd anticipated. These people had known her father, had respected him. Many had known her since childhood. There was a comfort in that familiarity that Boston, for all its advantages, had never provided. When the music slowed for a waltz, Preston held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Foster?" Zadie placed her hand in his. "You may, Sheriff Abernathy." As he led her onto the dance floor, she was acutely aware of the eyes upon them. There would be talk, speculation. In a small town like Silver Creek, their renewed relationship, whatever it might be, was public property. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked quietly as Preston placed his hand at her waist. It will set tongues wagging. Let them wag, he replied, his gaze steady on hers. I'm not hiding how I feel about you, Zadie. And how do you feel? The question was bold, but Zadie needed to know. Preston guided her through a turn before answering. I think you know, I never stopped loving you. I tried, believe me, I tried, but seeing you again, it's like the years between never happened. But they did happen, Zadie said softly. We're different people now. Yes, we are. And I'm finding I care for the woman you've become even more than the girl I once knew. His expression was earnest. The question is, how do you feel about me? The music swelled around them as Zadie considered her answer. I'm afraid, she finally admitted. Not of you, but of making another mistake, of hurting you again. I'm not asking for forever tonight, Zadie, just honesty. She met his gaze directly. Then, honestly, I'm falling in love with you all over again, and it terrifies me. Relief and joy spread across Preston's features. He pulled her slightly closer as they continued to dance. Then we'll be terrified together. The simple acceptance in his words brought tears to Zadie's eyes. This man who had every reason to guard his heart against her was instead offering it freely, asking only for honesty in return. After the dance, Preston suggested they step outside for some air. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds. I received a telegram yesterday, Zadie said as they strolled along the quiet street. From the school in Boston. They need my answer about returning for the fall term. Preston's step faltered slightly, but he didn't immediately respond. I have to decide soon, she continued. By tomorrow, really, to get the telegram back in time. I see. His voice was carefully neutral. And have you made your decision? Zadie stopped walking and turned to face him. Not yet. There are considerations, such as my position at the school, the security it provides. Preston nodded. That's important. Judge Harmon offered to teach me law today, to apprentice with him. Preston's eyebrows rose in surprise. Did he? That's quite an honor. He's never taken an apprentice before. He said he's been thinking of retiring. He's been saying that for years. A small smile touched Preston's lips, but he might actually mean it if he has someone to carry on his work. Zadie took a deep breath. And then there's you. Me. Yes, you, us, whatever this is between us. She gestured between them. I can't pretend it isn't a factor in my decision. Preston took her hands in his. Zadie, I won't pressure you. This has to be your choice based on what you truly want for your life. What if I don't know what that is anymore? Then you need to figure it out, and I'll respect whatever you decide. He squeezed her hands gently. But know this, if you choose to stay in Silver Creek, I'll be here. If you choose to return to Boston, I'll understand. And if you need time to decide what you truly want, I'll wait. The generosity of his response moved her deeply. You'd wait, again? For you? Yes. The certainty in his voice was unmistakable. But this time we'd write, visit when possible, find a way forward together if that's what you want. The possibility he was offering a chance to explore their feelings without an immediate, all-or-nothing choice seemed like a gift Zadie hadn't known she needed. I'd like that, she said softly. Preston's face lit with hope. Then that's what we'll do. You return to Boston if that's what you need to do, and we'll see where this leads us. They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, a new understanding between them. At her door, Preston kissed her a promise, not a goodbye. Sleep well, Zadie. Tomorrow is a new day. But sleep proved elusive. Zadie sat at the small desk in her room, drafting and redrafting her response to Mrs. Whitmore. Each version felt wrong somehow, incomplete. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky, she made her decision. She dressed quickly and made her way to the telegraph office, waiting on its steps until the operator arrived to open for the day. Her message was brief but clear. Regret, unable to return for fall term. Have decided to remain in Silver Creek to study law. Please accept my resignation. Will write with details. Regards, Z. Foster. As she walked back to the hotel, Zadie felt lighter than she had in years. The decision had been made not out of fear or obligation, but out of a growing sense of purpose and possibility. At breakfast, she found Preston waiting in the hotel restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee and looking as though he too had slept little. "Good morning," she greeted him, taking the seat across from him. "Morning." His smile was tentative. "You look resolved." "I am." Zadie poured herself coffee from the pot on the table. "I've sent my resignation to the school in Boston. I'm staying in Silver Creek." Preston's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "You're staying? What changed your mind?" "Everything. Nothing." Zadie laughed softly at her own contradiction. "I realized that Boston was where I ran to, not where I was running toward. I've been hiding there, not living. And Silver Creek is where you want to live." There was cautious hope in his question. "It's where I want to build a life," she corrected gently. "My father's practice, Judge Harmon's offer their opportunities to do meaningful work, to continue my father's legacy in my own way." "And us." Preston set down his cup. Zadie reached across the table to take his hand. "I'd like to discover what us might mean now. If you're still willing to find out together." The smile that spread across Preston's face was answer enough, but he squeezed her hand and said, "I'd like nothing better." Over the next 6 months, Zadie immersed herself in her new life. Judge Harmon proved a demanding but excellent teacher, and she found herself intellectually challenged in ways her teaching position never had provided. She maintained her father's office in town, gradually taking on small legal matters under the judge's supervision while studying for more complex cases. The Foster property remained in her possession, though she continued to rent it to the Millers while living in a small apartment above the law office. Every month, James Miller added to their savings toward eventual purchase, and Zadie found herself impressed by their dedication and integrity. As for Preston, their relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and honest communication. They dined together most evenings, sometimes at the hotel, sometimes at his home with Mrs. Byens's excellent cooking. Occasionally at the small apartment, Zadie had furnished with items from her father's house and new pieces that reflected her own taste. It was on a crisp December evening, with snow falling gently outside her window, that Preston arrived for dinner with an unusually serious expression. "Is something wrong?" Zadie asked as she took his coat. "No, not wrong." Preston seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "Just important." They ate the simple meal Zadie had prepared. She'd never be the cook, Mrs. Byens was, but she'd learned to manage basic dishes with conversation that flowed easily between them, as it always did now. After dinner, as they sat before the small fireplace with glasses of sherry, Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I've been carrying this for almost 6 years," he said quietly, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I had it made for you in Denver before you left." Zadie's breath caught. "You kept it all this time?" "I couldn't bring myself to part with it." He met her gaze directly. "It represented hope, I suppose, even when I told myself I'd moved on." With deliberate movements, he set his glass aside and knelt before her. "Zadie Foster, I'm not asking you to be the person you were then, and I'm not the man I was either. But I love the woman you are now, your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Zadie's eyes. "Are you certain, after everything? More certain than I've ever been about anything." His expression was solemn. "The past is past, Zadie. I'm interested only in our future." "Then yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Preston Abernathy, I will marry you." His face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. They were married in the spring, when wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the air was sweet with possibility. The whole town turned out for the ceremony at the church, followed by a celebration that spilled into the town square. Judge Harmon officiated, his usually gruff demeanor softened by evident pleasure at uniting the daughter of his oldest friend with the young sheriff he'd mentored. Harold would be proud, he told Zadie as he kissed her cheek after pronouncing them husband and wife. Of both of you. That evening, as they prepared to leave for a brief honeymoon in Denver, Preston handed Zadie an envelope. A wedding gift, he explained. Open it. Inside was a deed to the Foster property, but the names listed as owners were James and Mary Miller. Preston, I don't understand. How? I bought it from you, he explained with a smile. Or rather, the bank did, with a loan in the Miller's name. They'll pay it off over 15 years, but the property is theirs now. Zadie was speechless. But why? When? Because I saw how much it meant to them. And how torn you were about selling it. He shrugged slightly. The arrangements were finalized yesterday. I wanted it to be a surprise. But it's worth far more than they could afford. I negotiated a fair price with the bank. Enough to give you a good start for your own practice when you're ready, but not so much that the Millers can't manage the payments. He took her hands in his. Your father believed in giving people chances, Zadie. I thought you might want to continue that tradition. Tears filled her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. It's perfect, thank you. Preston's expression grew more serious. There's one more thing. I know we haven't discussed it much, but I thought perhaps one day we might build our own home. Near town, but with some land for horses, for children to run and play. The future he was envisioning their future suddenly seemed very real and very right. I'd like that, Zadie said softly. Very much. 2 years later, on a warm summer evening, Preston and Zadie sat on the porch of their new home on the outskirts of Silver Creek. The house was modest but well built, with large windows that caught the morning light and a wide porch where they often ended their days together. Preston rocked gently in his chair, their infant daughter asleep against his chest. Zadie watched them, her heart full. Penny for your thoughts, Preston said quietly, careful not to wake the baby. I was thinking about the day I returned to Silver Creek, Zadie replied. How different everything is now from what I imagined then. Regrets. His question held no anxiety, just genuine curiosity, not a single one. She smiled, reaching over to take his free hand. I came back thinking I wasn't the person you remembered. And I told you we could start again that night. Preston's thumb traced circles on her palm. Little did I know we'd be building something even better than what we had before. Zadie nodded, watching as their daughter stirred slightly before settling back into sleep. Something stronger, truer. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In the distance, Silver Creek was visible, no longer the place she'd fled, but the home she'd chosen. I love you, Zadie Abernathy, Preston said softly. And I love you, she replied, the words flowing as naturally as the creek that ran behind their property. Always. They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened, sharing the peace they'd found together, not perfect, not without challenges, but real and lasting. A love built not on youthful passion alone, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to begin again. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Zadie reflected that starting again had been the greatest gift they'd given each other, the chance to fall in love not with the people they'd been, but with the people they'd become. And in that second chance, they'd found everything they'd ever wanted.